Hello and greetings from the Center for Contemporary Mysticism. My name is Joe Irwin and I want to welcome you to today's online center program. If you're like most of us, we've missed being able to gather together as we normally do once a month to have our Sunday afternoon programs, but it's wonderful that we now have this technology where we can come together even if it's in virtual format. So welcome, we're glad you're with us. Today's program is entitled Anxiety and the Pandemic, and we're pleased to have as our guest Ms. Zway Kwok. Zway is a person with an amazing life story, from escaping Vietnam in a boat at only 6 months of age to growing up in a rough inner-city neighborhood of Philadelphia to going on to attend Harvard and Wharton School of Business. So you can see she is a survivor and well equipped in helping us take a look at this issue that we're all dealing with today. So we, in fact, have more online programs planned for you coming up. And if you stay tuned at the end of this meeting, we'll give you some more details. But now we're eager to get busy and turn our focus on anxiety and the pandemic. Our conversation will be led by Patricia Pierce. Again, she's a member of the board, also an author, a spiritual teacher, and a former pastor. So at this time, I'll turn the program over to Patricia and ask her to introduce Zway.
Zway, thank you for being willing and able to be in this conversation with me today. It's really great to see you and talk with you. And I want to first start off by just letting the viewers know that you are, one of the things that you do, among many things that you do, is you have an organization, Calm Clarity, and you really help people transcend what you refer to as brain 1.0 and 2.0 and into brain 3.0. And you yourself, and we can talk more about that, but we're in the midst of this pandemic right now, and people are dealing with a lot of anxiety. And you are well versed in what it's like to be in the throes of anxiety. And you yourself, your life journey has equipped you to help people manage that. So before we move into that, maybe you could just let the viewers know, sort of in an encapsulated form, something about your experience and your journey that has equipped you to be the expert in this that you are.
Sure. Well, I am a survivor of the refugee experience. My parents escaped Vietnam when I was 6 months old, and I had to survive a very dangerous journey at sea, in which our boat nearly perished in storms. Got to the refugee camp, luckily, but then had to spend about 15 months in terrible, unhygienic conditions, in which, as a baby, I caught many diseases and nearly died several times. So that was just the beginning of my life, right? And then we were lucky. We got to settle in the U.S. However, it was in a rather dangerous neighborhood, Logan section of Philadelphia, where people made very clear that refugees weren't wanted. There was a lot of violence and discrimination and hate crimes against the new refugees. And unfortunately, we knew relatives and friends who were attacked, right? Luckily, my immediate family was fine, but cousins were jumped and beat up and whatnot. Anyway, and then my parents took over a takeout restaurant in West Oak Lane, which for us was an amazing experience at first. And then we started seeing gang members come into the takeout and beat people up, rob people, shoot into this takeout. And then when I was in middle school, one of our customers was shot in the head within the store. And so the violence that I've witnessed has been horrific, right? And yet, because I was just incredibly resilient and I could focus on the positive and moving forward, I somehow got into Harvard University and then had to start over in this completely different environment, deal with the culture shock, completely different way of interacting, completely different norms, people who had extraordinarily different experiences from my own, and learn how to build connections, build friendships, build new way of living, right, in this different environment, while dealing with the feelings of social alienation, isolation, imposter syndrome, not belonging, and realizing that there was this very dark place in my mind that if it took over, I would cry for days. I could have panic attacks for, hours and not be able to function. And I had to learn how to make peace with this dark place inside my mind, and shift it, right, to befriend it and understand why it did what it did, what its purpose was, but to also calm this voice and help it adjust, right, and bring it into, this. It's hard to explain social mobility, because most people think of it as an enormous good, that if you are able to move from poverty into middle class, upper middle class environment, that's all positive. However, that feeling of shame and stigma, that feeling of confusion about, do you assimilate? Do you change your values? Do you lose your identity? Of becoming uprooted, becoming tribeless, and feeling psychologically homeless. Very few schools actually help students with that transition. And most students are left on their own to make sense of who they are and what their place in the world is, what their values are. Do they accept the values of the new environment? What values do they hold from their previous upbringing? And it takes a lot of fortitude and courage to carve out a path when the paths that you see from, your upbringing don't apply, and the paths that you see, from my classmates at Harvard, they had access to opportunities that I would never have access to based on their family connections and, just how they were being bred to assume leadership positions, whether or not they really earned them, right? And that was never going to happen for me in the same way. However, what was I going to be able to do to find a path for myself that wasn't conditioned by their stories, right? That, allowed me to build a sense of self. It took a while, but, eventually I started to see 3 versions of me, right? So there was that brain 1.0 version, which I call which is my name for when your brain is in the freeze, fight, flight pattern, and you're kind of contracting, right? You're withdrawing, you're isolating. But the mind is a very negative place where you're beating yourself up, or you're complaining about the world and how there's no place for you in it. And it's very hopeless and pessimistic. And then there's the brain 2.0 version of myself, which was like the type that runs the rat race. If there's a hoop to jump through, I'm like, how do I jump through the hoop faster than everyone else, right? How do I get my reward from, the way society sets up the game? How do I get through the game? Because it's a matter of survival. It's a matter of my family, being able to pay bills. It's a matter, like, the stakes are so high, I can't not play this game, even if I don't want to play the game. The rewards of playing the game means social mobility for me, right? But without getting so entangled with the game that if I had a setback, or I had, I lost something, or I screwed up, I made a mistake, or, I was told I couldn't even play a particular game, I was rejected from the beginning. How do I just let go of it without being so attached to it that I go into a deep depression in brain 1.0, right? And I noticed these 2 parts of the brain were very related. Whenever you feel empty, like you feel, dark emotions, sometimes it feels so bad that the best thing to do is to win something, right? Right. So for me, achievement was a way of covering that hole. And part of that survival technique, right, got me through high school and got me to a place like Harvard. So it wasn't that bad that I used achievement versus drugs, as a form of self-medication. However, at Harvard, I saw that there were limits to the way this worked, and a lot of the processes that were set up, if I kept playing these games, it was exhausting. Jumping through these hoops were exhausting. And the competition for jumping through these hoops at Harvard were like, ridiculously high, right? And so I was just like, this is not leading to happiness, even when I do win, even when I do make it to the next stage. What is it that actually like makes me besides being this wonderful, hoop jumper, right? And so it was learning for the sake of learning versus learning for the sake of getting great. And that gift, right? That gift to appreciate knowledge, to appreciate learning, to appreciate wisdom, to appreciate growth, right? And self-actualization, like that part of me, guided me through the recovery process. So I decided to seek help. So I did see a psychiatrist.
And this was in response to what you're describing with the brain 1.0, the panic attacks and that part of the brain just sort of taking over control, right?
Yeah, and it was entangled, brain 2.0 and brain 1.0 entangled. Yeah. So extreme anxiety is actually tied to the dopamine system, right? It's not just stress hormones. And so there's a difference between primal fear, which is when your life is in real danger, versus like psychological fear, which we call anxiety, when you're worried about an outcome that you're attached to not happening.
Right. And I think of it, a couple words I sometimes use are instinctive fear, which is the bus is barreling down the street at you, versus imaginary fear, where the mind is imagining some scenario and responding emotionally to what it's imagining.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's more, like sometimes I would call it psychological fear, because the psychological damage is true.
Yes.
Imagined.
Yes.
There's true psychological damage.
Right.
However, a lot of times it's based on attachment to an outcome that you can't control.
Right.
Right. And then beating yourself up for not being able to control that outcome versus looking at what you actually can control and doing everything you can to make the situation better. So it's a lot of it, it's like putting attention in ways that exhaust you versus focusing your attention on something that's constructive, right? And so when it came to my situation, I started to realize that, I was actually exhausting myself because of Brain 2.0. This need to compete with the best of the best, right? This need to, get good grades. This need to try to get the best internships, the best opportunities, right? And to like compete with the herd. And if I let go of benchmarking myself with the herd, if I stopped caring about what everyone else was doing, there was a lot more space and calmness inside me. So I had to learn to not to deal with what people call FOMO, the fear of missing out, because that's a huge cause of anxiety. You're like, everyone else is doing X, Y, or Z. Why aren't I doing that? What's wrong with me? Am I doing the wrong thing? And there's a lot of self-doubt and questioning if you don't have a strong sense of self. Right. And at Harvard.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So at Harvard, even though you think everyone has a strong sense of self, this competitive instinct, right, to want to be above average, even at Harvard, I think drove a lot of students neurotic, right?
Mm-hmm. So when you think about, and you tell your story in your book, Calm Clarity, and how it is that you went to see a psychiatrist, you were able to use medications to help calm the experience you were having, and you knew that was not a long-term solution for you, that you needed to understand what was happening in your brain and find ways to heal your brain from the trauma that you had experienced in your earlier life. And as you look back, I'm sort of zooming out for a moment to our present context. And when you look at what is happening now in the culture and the fear and the uncertainty and the trauma that a lot of people are facing right now, what would you, based on your experience of navigating through seasons of intense um, anguish that came from anxiety, what would you tell people about how to be present in these times and work with those impulses in them that might really be going to a very, very dark and catastrophic place?
Sure. Actually, every Monday I send out a quote for the week for people to meditate on to activate Brain 3.0. And the one I prepared for Monday actually says, or for tomorrow, says, I guess technically it won't be tomorrow when we play this video.
Right.
But I guess it would go out April 27th. Okay. Inner peace arises from the capacity to abide in uncertainty and ambiguity while holding space for all the feelings they stir up inside. Right. And then the meditation exercise that comes with this says, pay attention to how uncertainty and ambiguity triggers stress, discomfort, and anxiety, as well as urges to escape these feelings by creating a false sense of certainty and control. Tell these feelings and urges that you can hold space for them and allow yourself to fully feel the sensations they bring up in your body. Mm-hmm. And that's what I learned how to do. My time at Harvard, it's to not try to make Brain 1.0 go away.
Right.
Not try to doom or exile that dark voice in my head, but just to befriend it and say, you exist for a reason. You know, have been conditioned by all my negative experiences to be afraid and to reject myself before other people can reject me. Got it. Right?
Yeah.
And you come up more when I'm in Brain 2.0 and I want something and I'm afraid of not getting it. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. And so, and the more I hate the way I feel, the more I want to escape it by doing something that creates certainty and control, even if it's the wrong path.
Right. Yeah. And that's the irony, isn't it? That the more we try to escape something like that, the more we are being held captive to it. And you're describing in those moments to not try to make anything go away, to not try to fix what's happening in the mind, but to be present to it, to accept it, and hold it compassionately. You just said, you know, to acknowledge that you exist for a reason. Thank you. And just to be in it and to honor what's happening in the body and the mind. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which I think is, you know, when I think about consciousness, it is about awareness. So what you're describing, Zway, is you're describing the process of expanding our consciousness because we're expanding our awareness. That may not be terminology that you typically use, but that's what that would be my way, a way that I would.
Well, I mean, I'm a visual person, and for me, like, I can see a person and their mind being open and expansive, where you're not suppressing, projecting, you're allowing whatever is true to be, right? You're not trying to make your beliefs real and try to force reality to conform to what you want or what your beliefs are, right? That is a mind that is super supple, right? And resilient and bouncy, right? It's fun even, it's playful even. It can still see joy in moments of darkness, right? And hardship. Whereas like minds that, you know, are trying so hard to make what they think is right happen, right? Those minds are like blocks, you know, they're like blocks of coal, right? And they're very hardened. They're not adaptable. They're not like this idea of water, how water takes whatever shape. Like a very supple mind is able to play with lots of different shapes, but know that none of the shapes like define them.
Yes, right. The shape isn't the mind.
Whereas a hardened mind says, this is my identity. This is what I look like. This is my shape. If something about that appearance changes, it's like you pull the carpet underneath them. They feel very, very destabilized.
Wow. And that makes me think, Zway, of this situation that we're in collectively, where so many people's, employment or roles or maybe even worldviews are being threatened or challenged, and how much we can identify ourselves with those things, rather than understanding, like you're saying, that's simply a shape that the water has taken on. It's not what the mind is. It's not what our identity is necessarily.
And,
yeah.
People use this term adversity tolerance a lot to describe, people who've gone on journeys like mine who experience a great deal of post-traumatic growth, right? And it's this concept that when you've weathered a lot of storms, right, storms don't bother you anymore. They just become a fact of life. And so my father, who had survived the Vietnam War, this whole crazy refugee experience, which he remembers. I was a baby, so I don't fully remember all the dangers we experienced, right? This doesn't faze him as much as it is phasing other people. Like he still goes out to the store every day. He's in his 70s. Nothing I can say can stop him when he has a craving for like fresh mangoes. He goes out and buys like boxes of fresh mangoes. And part of me is just kind of delighted that he still has this joy de vivre, where he wants to enjoy a mango and he goes out and gets it, right? So I'm like, okay, we make sure he like wears a face mask and does the precautions to the extent that he can. But for him, it's just like,
This is nothing compared to what I've seen. Wow. Yeah. Which is, resilience is another, I think you've used that word as well. Yeah. When you talk about being present and accepting of whatever a person is feeling.
Mm-hmm.
There is I'm experiencing this in my own life. There's such a spectrum of feeling right now that's present. I happen to be in a fairly privileged situation where I'm not being placed in danger. Like I don't have to go out and do a job that is placing me in danger of this virus. And my heart goes out to the people who are working in the hospitals and doing all of these things where they really are in the thick of this storm. And I honor the fact that there are some very, very intense feelings and anxiety and grief and, all of that. My situation is different. And I actually at times have been experiencing this ecstatic joy that is, I feel it is in relation to a profound transformation that's happening on the planet, and that joy energy is part of the world that wants to arise, that it arises out of that joy energy. So I think sometimes people can even feel guilty maybe about feeling joy right now because they might think that it's inappropriate given the situation. And as you're saying, whatever the feeling is, it's to be met with awareness and acceptance. So I'm just aware that our viewers probably, they might find themselves somewhere on that spectrum of feeling, or even moving back and forth between ends of those feelings.
I would say being human, you can experience a whole spectrum of emotion. This is what they call bittersweet happiness, or poignant emotions, where you see such sublime beauty, and yet you are also aware of such extreme suffering. And yet the depictions of the Buddhas are always joyful, because even as they're helping people who are suffering, right? And it's interesting in the Buddhist tradition, the Tibetan one at least, we often say the four immeasurables. And I've kind of rephrased them a little bit based on my intuitive understanding of the meaning, because the translations are not always precise, right? So the first one will say, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. And that's a whole mystery to unravel. Like, what are the causes of happiness, right? May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Again, another riddle. What are the causes of suffering? And then it says, may all beings never be separated from the pure happiness that knows no sorrow, no suffering. And it's like, what is that? Some people say that's beyond sorrow or suffering. And I think of it as the primordial happiness that we come from, which transforms and heals all suffering and sorrow, right? And the last one is, may all abide in equanimity, free from attachment, free from aversion. And for me, that means being free from what the Buddhists call karmic entanglement, right? And so as you put them together, the causes of happiness is this freedom from attachment and aversion, this freedom from karmic entanglement, and the causes of suffering is the attachment and the aversion that cause the entanglement, right? And when you are able to let those go and shed them, that's when you experience this new connection to that primordial pure happiness that is not conditioned by what's happening in your life. It is something that you know that you are, and you don't need permission to be or feel, right? And so it is a strange paradox that, even as this coronavirus has swept through the world and caused so much economic turmoil and suffering, the world is still blooming in spring in this side of the hemisphere, right? And flowers or the cherry blossoms were still gorgeous, right? Like everything is still unfolding, even though many people are suffering. And it's also a metaphor for resilience, because what this is creating is, space for us to break habits.
Yes.
We had so many unhealthy habits, especially unhealthy expectations by workplaces, right? Yes. Unhealthy gender bias, unhealthy socioeconomic biases, racial biases, ethnic biases, all sorts of things that were ingrained in the way in which our daily routines were built. And this is causing us to rebuild new routines, and hopefully we can address a lot of our misguided biases as we rebuild new routines.
Yes. Hear, hear. So this interview, of course, will be on the Center for Contemporary Mysticism's website, and you yourself, you don't usually focus on this aspect of your experience, but you have had some very profound mystical experiences over the years, and you just were telling me earlier about a vision that you had on Easter in this context in which we find ourselves, right? And I would love to hear you talk about what you saw and perceived.
Sure. I mean, I personally think of myself as very plugged into reality, right? Whatever that means. And I'm a social entrepreneur, and I challenge and push clients to address social justice, right? To look at socioeconomic inequity, to push towards inclusion across all fronts, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's socioeconomic, religion, but to see every single person as a human being and treat them accordingly. And also to address legacy issues like white supremacy, oligarchy, colonial mentalities, and things like that. And so that's a huge part of who I am as a person and the work that I do, and what I consider, right livelihood, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think on Easter, I was, the weeks leading up to Easter, I was quite torn by the suffering. And the toll of the pandemic, the disproportionate toll on low-income communities, particularly people of color, and just structural barriers, to opportunity, and how those barriers just got a lot bigger. The walls just got a lot higher. The floor just went much further down. Right? Like my work with the Collective Success Network is about helping first-generation college students from low-income backgrounds complete college. And most of them don't have the resources and buffers to navigate this current environment. to pay for tuition while everyone has lost jobs, right? To work, have lost access to work study, lost access to many of their incomes that came from working on campus, lost access to computer labs, right? And how are they going to survive? How are they going to stay on track to graduation, right? And I do a lot of research looking at economics and reading reports about social mobility and unconscious bias and things like that. So I think of myself as very, very grounded in the world. And so, when visions come to me, usually it helps me navigate the path forward to build organizations I'm building, to connect with others, to build alliances and collaborations and partnerships. They're usually very pragmatic visions, right? And so this one, was very relevant to my work. So what I saw, with all my frustration and anguish about the world as it is, was a conversation with the collective consciousness, showing me why we're here, why we're doing what we're doing, and where this is leading, right? And so what I saw, it's always hard to put these in words because they come as energetic transmissions, and to even call them visions, they don't. Sometimes I see an HD TV in my mind, I really see visuals, but this one was more like thought forms being dropped. So I could see the narrative that they were sharing, but it wasn't a picture story. Sometimes it's a picture story, which is fascinating. But what I saw was that eons ago, when we decided to create this planet, the collective consciousness decided to be embodied in human form. And the experiment was to show that we could go from animal consciousness to creating a society that embodies the ideals that we do have now that are being expressed, like justice, an end to poverty, abundance, equity, peace, prosperity, all of the things that we strive for, that we want, we're hungry for now. An end to suffering, that we could live and support each other in prosperity, harmony, that we could nurture each other and live in a state of joy because our needs were met. And we would metaphorically call this heaven in some ways, right? But this is a long-term roadmap. It's not something that was going to happen overnight, right? And it showed me how we've made so much progress since the beginning of the journey to get to where we are today, where we do have things like the United Nations and the World Health Organizations. We do believe in human rights. We believe it's illegal to enslave other human beings and treat them as property. That wasn't always the case. If you look at the Roman times, it was normal to live half your life in slavery. You could be born free and then become enslaved, no matter who you were. And so with where we are today, there's still problems, right? And we, as a collective consciousness, we created differences in appearance in order to combat tribalism or address tribalism. So yes, we knew we were going to have great suffering because we have this us versus them hardwiring in our tribal DNA. And yet we're going to transcend this eventually. We have this part of us, which I call Brain 2.0, which seeks dominance, power, and control, and is constantly hijacking us out of a state of oneness, out of a state of being in Brain 3.0, being guided by our collective wisdom. And eventually by growing, by redesigning society to nurture and strengthen what I call Brain 3.0, but these neural networks that allow us to see the bigger picture and co-create with the collective consciousness, like we would eventually transcend Brain 2.0. But it's when we are in Brain 2.0, when we're fighting for our self-interest, even as it harms other people sometimes, right? That's when we create huge inequalities. That's how You know, people hoard things that they don't need, right? And then we build ways to preserve that over generations. So it gets the inequality, the disparities get bigger and bigger and bigger versus using these resources for the collective well-being. But we are still tribal in that we are looking out for our families first before we look out for our people who we perceive as strangers to us, right? But the truth is, in the spiritual realm, like we're all brothers and sisters, and our ability to see that in Brain 3.0 is constantly impaired by being in Brain 2.0 and wanting to be superior in status to other people, right? And this need for us to benchmark, to compare, to move up a social hierarchy, that gets in the way so often of our ability to hold space, to co-create, right? And throughout history, you see, leaders who get hijacked by Brain 2.0, by power, by dominance. That's why there's these sayings that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? Because we have not disciplined ourselves to manage Brain 2.0, to rein it in, because it can do good. Like Brain 2.0 allows us to manage projects, to manage deadlines, to have goals, to hold people accountable for what they promise to do, right? It's not all negative, but when it hijacks us, right, that's when the ego takes over. That's when you see a lot of the leadership faux pas that have happened recently, right? It's when who they are and their ego matters more than what they do for the greater good.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about that, the Brain 2.0 hijacking our ability to be in 3.0, and I'm looking at this COVID situation as you are as well, as an opportunity for us to really step back and look at the world we've created and to become more aware of the world that we want to create and what does that look like. So it seems like the vision that you had, where you saw the long-term trajectory of this experiment on this planet, it just seems like this pandemic situation is helping accelerate the process by snapping us out of our routines and helping us see things more clearly and hopefully imagine from that more transcendent place how we would like to move forward.
I mean, you already start to see signs of this Brain 3.0 altruistic mindset being expressed, right? Yes. Volunteer healthcare workers from all over the country are going to New York without being paid to.
Right.
To contribute their skills. People coming out of retirement who might be at risk, higher risk for COVID, are taking care of patients, right? You see it in collaborations that were unheard of in the science world. Because in science, people can be extremely competitive about racing towards a cure, because it's their Nobel Prize, right?
Right.
And now people are like, let's just take down those walls. Let's just, share knowledge and let's accelerate the process of innovation, you know? And so there are signs across the world of people reaching out to each other in Brain 3.0. And, even like politically, you have healthcare policymakers and scientists and researchers across the world lending each other a hand, right? So, and despite like the media sensationalizing political differences, countries have been sending PPE to each other, right? Like China has been sending a lot of PPE to emerging countries like Iran and other places who really wouldn't get PPE. I saw the news that Turkey sent PPE to the UK, right? And so these are precious resources right now, but people are realizing how precious they are when they're used versus when they sit in storage, Right. And so it's been very inspiring if you look for how people are coming together to help each other versus how, people are blaming and
Right, and
pointing
competing.
fingers at each other.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, there again, which, what are we going to choose to focus on? Well, I want to make
Yeah.
sure that people know how to connect with what you're about. And you have a book called Clarity, where I see it behind you there on your bookshelf.
Mhm.
And that tells your story. And it also goes into great detail about neuroscience and these different brain 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. And it's a great book. I've read it. I would highly recommend it. So let me just say that.
Yeah.
And also, people can find you on the web. What URL? What shall we do?
Sure. So I have two organizations. The one you named, ConClarity, is conclarity.org. And then for people who aren't readers or who are looking for more practical insights, those weekly thoughts that I share, we've compiled 52 of them into ConClarity cards. And so you can shuffle them and use them to help activate Brain 3.0 on a daily basis, right? Because they're all messages to help bring people into Brain 3.0. And of course, the book has the roadmap for how to activate and strengthen Brain 3.0 over time. And then on the more practical social justice type of work that I do, I started a second organization called the Collective Success Network, specifically to help first generation college students from low income backgrounds complete college and achieve social economic mobility to actually enter a career that they went to college for. And so we've established a student relief fund where we give out $50 grants to students to buy essentials like food, toilet paper, household cleaning supplies. And we are collecting laptops for students who don't have computers to take online classes. So people can go to collectivesuccess.org to learn more about that nonprofit and chip in and help.
Great. Well, Zway, thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today, and I really wish you all the best and blessings on your work and all the lives that you're touching.
Thank you, and good luck to you too. Thank you for holding these conversations and helping guide people in the midst of this pandemic to find oneness.
Thanks. All right. Well, until soon. Be well.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Zway, for sharing yourself and your story and your wisdom with us today. It's inspiring to know that there are ways in which during this pandemic and these difficult times we can find hope and a new way of looking at things and experiencing both the world and ourselves. So we're so grateful for your presence with us today. And thank you, Patricia, for your help and wisdom in leading our conversation today. I wanted to mention that our next program on May 24th, we'll be inviting the Reverend Cliff Cutler, who is a lifelong Episcopalian priest, but also in many ways a student of mysticism and history. And he's going to be helping us take a look at pandemics and other tragedies that come into our world over history and seeing how they each call us to take a look at ourselves. And we'll be talking about things like what is the pandemic calling us to look at today, not only as individuals, but as a culture and as a world? Could it be calling us to look at issues of inclusion and equality? So it should be a wonderful program coming up, and so we hope you will be with us then. In the meantime, thanks so much for being a part of our center family. We depend upon you and are grateful for each of you, and we wish you blessings and good health in the days ahead. Godspeed.